Wow. There you have it. Yeah, we are in the thick of it here, and I do hope you feel welcome. You know, it's interesting being a part of a community. Some of you have been here for maybe all of your lives, and so like the 50th celebration means quite a bit to you. Others, it could be your first few weeks here or even day, I don't know. And so we're all at different places. We recognize that. And with that can come some challenges. Anytime you enter into a new community, you just have to be patient. You have to be patient. And sorry, while I adjust all of these cords, it takes time. And so I hope that you're willing just to take the time to get to know each other. In fact, I would argue that we need to work very hard as a community at welcoming others into our midst. And that is a challenging thing. Our culture typically trains us to put on a bit of a mask and put up a bit of a front. And so the normal way of greeting each other is just, I'm fine, I'm good. But I would encourage us to, as a community, work on moving past that. Now, it might not work out in the coffee setting afterwards. You're not necessarily going to bare your entire soul, but I really do encourage us as a church to find those places, and there are many small little fellowships. You can be a part of a place where you can truly share what is on your heart. That is what it means to be the body together. And that's why we read that verse from Galatians, a little bit funny. And it's going to make sense as we go through the scriptures. And you know that we're in the Book of Esther. It's a very peculiar book, very challenging to preach. And we are right in the thick of it. I've got chapters 7 and 8. And really, this book is coming to a head. This is a major moment, and we're going to get into that. But my hope through these chapters that we read together is that we work on being that authentic community that we're called to be as Christians. Like I said, to remove that mask. And really, as I was prepping this, it starts with me up here this morning. I can ask you to be authentic, but am I willing to be authentic? As one of the leaders in this church with the youth and the kids, am I willing to confess my sin before you? Galatians 6:2 says this, we just read it, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That authenticity, a place where we can come and share what is truly going on in our lives. And to be honest with you, for having an honest moment, I've had kind of a more challenging couple of weeks prior to this, feeling a little bit run down. I'm not sure exactly what it is or was, but it was during that time in prayer and confession, it really came to me that I am a cheater. Yeah, some of you look kind of shocked, but I'm a cheater. That's right, we're opening this with some real authenticity, some real confession. And it's true, it came to me that my life is full of shortcuts, of taking the easy way, of serving the self, that I am actually bent on the cheater way. It's true. The cheater way of fantasy, of living into falsehood, of dreaming of other circumstances. Can anyone relate? Dare I get more specific? That's a pretty safe confession. Well, I was doing my taxes just a couple of weeks ago. Last minute. And I have to pay, I have rental income, right? We have our house in Victoria. So lots of rental income. You have to pay tax on that, by the way. But I know I was doing everything I could to lean into that cheating disposition. Now, I realize there's tax strategy, and we could talk after this about all of that. But the illustration I want to bring forward is that I want the best outcome for me, that I don't really want to pay my fair share. Not really. I want to cheat. You went quiet. You know, even at work here, I cheat. I am lazy. Will you believe it? I watch YouTube videos when I shouldn't. You laugh, you chuckle, but I am very easily distracted. I could be spending much more time doing important things, yet I find myself cutting corners. That fantasy living, wishing I had a different life, a better life, bending the world around myself to serve myself. I am a lazy, fantasizing cheater. Perhaps you should have, chosen better when you hired. Maybe you could have found somebody, who actually has it all together. I don't know if you've ever seen the job requirements for a pastor. They basically want to hire Jesus. And it's pretty funny. It's pretty funny. But the reality is, when God shines that spotlight in our lives, and if we are willing to take the time to pay attention, it is not very pretty. It's not. All right, the sin is not very pretty. Romans chapter 7, Paul is with us this morning. He cries out, he says, "The trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate, and I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway." That's the ugly stuff. That's what we're dealing with this morning, the ugly stuff. So how do we wash ourselves? How do we make ourselves clean? Not on the outside, the inside. Because sin catches up. Evil has a way of reemerging. The sins of our forefathers visit us and revisit us, as we learn in Exodus chapter 20, that to harbor sin in our lives will lead to our destruction. It's very destructive. God does not want us to remain in sin, in rebellion. And that's what we read in Esther chapter 7, verse 1. Our reading begins. "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, 'Tell me, what do you want?' Queen Esther, 'What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom.'" This is Xerxes or Ahasuerus, two names we know him by. And this is a moment that's been building in the story. It's been coming, this second banquet. We are at this crescendo. What will Queen Esther do? This is an incredible moment for her. It is not an easy position. She has two horrendous dinner guests, the worst kind. What will she do? I mean, Xerxes, we already know he's horrible, but in studying for this, I came across one of the stories of history where he was on the road with his army, and he comes across a wealthy gold merchant named Pythias, who has 4 sons, all in the service of Xerxes. And this man, Pythias, he asks Xerxes to spare his eldest, that his eldest might come and help him in his old age. Well, what do you think happened? The son was returned in 2 pieces. He split him down the middle and marched his army down the center. That is the kind of madman we're talking about. This Xerxes, this Ahasuerus. And the second dinner guest, Haman, is no better. Perhaps worse. He's cunning, he's sly, he's willingly plotting hell-bent murder against the Jewish people. Already in his courtyard stands a 75-foot sharpened pole for the slaughter of Mordecai. This is not your average dinner party, is it? The stakes are so high. Verse 3, Queen Esther replies, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared," she says. "For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary, and he is our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. That moment arrives for Esther. She chooses her words carefully. She, in fact, repeats the edict that Haman had set up against the Jews, the killing, the slaughtering, the annihilation of a people. Yet this is a very complex situation now because the king is also implicated in the crime. And perhaps that's why he goes off into the garden to cool down. But verse 7, we read on. Haman, however, he stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where the queen was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Nothing like a good old spearing. But there we have it. Esther, she reveals this terrible plot against the Jewish people. And in a raging frenzy, the king orders Haman's death on the very gallows, or the sharpened pole, that was set up to kill Mordecai. And so we have Haman's death, his death, and Mordecai's vindication. We have these two characters juxtaposed. You see the irony, you see the parallelism, the coincidence. It cannot be missed here in this text. And we've already noticed that the writer of the book of Esther is very clear. The message is clear. To stand against God, to stand against God's ways, ultimately leads to destruction. Or to harbor sin in your life ultimately leads to destruction. I think we need just to take a moment to consider Mordecai and Haman here, these two characters, to remind us of this contrasting narrative that is set up to remind us these deeper truths. We see Mordecai. He adopted Esther at a young age. We read that early in the story. So at a minimum, we recognize that he is kind and gracious, for adoption is never easy. It requires a lot of sacrifice. And that investment he gives to Esther continues as he advises her in her new role as queen. She rises to the top, we understood from the text. We also see that Mordecai is willing to save this king from assassination, this plot. He overhears and stops this plot. And no doubt this king had many enemies, Xerxes, but Mordecai opts to save the king's life. Even more indicative of his character, Mordecai stands up for what he believes in. When Haman wants him to bow down, he stands tall and proud of his heritage. Even in the face of the slaughtering of his own people, in mourning, in burlap and ashes, he refuses Esther's offer for new garments. Again, identifying himself with his people. That would do him no favors, obviously. There is something about Mordecai that we are meant to notice. That he is a man of integrity, a person who is willing to take risks for God, even requesting Esther to endanger her life to save her people. That this adopted daughter of his would risk her very life for the sake of the Jewish people. Mordecai, faithful, kind, humble, full of trust, full of integrity. How about Haman? He's the opposite. The enemy with a dark past. I believe it was already mentioned, but Haman is actually from the tribe of Amalek. And you may recall the tribe of Amalek. They, in fact, in some of the ancient rabbinical texts, the name is tied to the concept of drinking blood licking. So a people that were bent against goodness. In fact, in Exodus 17, we read that the Lord will wage war with Amalek and his descendants. This is Haman's heritage. Why would the Lord want to wage war with these people? Well, they were the chief enemy of Israel in the wilderness wandering under Moses. They were so relentless, they would pick off the stragglers as they wandered the desert. Even more so, the Amalekites were the people that would try to stop the Israelites from entering into the promised land. They were not just simply any enemy amongst many enemies. They were to be regarded as opponents of God's guidance and providence. In fact, under King Saul, it was ordered for the Amalekites to be totally destroyed. And we begin to see this was not just simply a people or an enemy. This was a way of life that was to be destroyed. And that way of life was bent on eliminating not only God's people, but also God's rule. That's who the Amalekites are. A way of life that surfaces generations later in Haman. See, Haman is more than just simply a vendetta against the Jewish people. He is a force opposed to the very presence of God. And we see that manifest in his life, in his actions, in his desires. Haman embodies rebellion against God. this spirit of Haman or of rebellion. It's a way of life that is opposed to the very ways of God. And what happens to Haman? Well, that evil consumes him. It catches up. He's killed. He's killed. Yet his plot, his evil plot against the Jewish people, it continues. And so we have to read a little bit further to find out what happens in chapter 8. This is verse 3. Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at her feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman, the Agagite, against the Jews. Again, the king held out his gold scepter to Esther. So she rose and stood before him. Esther said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who ordered that the Jews throughout the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked." And so we see this complication. In Persian law at the time, whatever was established or ordained by the king could not be reversed. And so what would they do? Well, in short, Mordecai and Esther, they come up with a plan for the Jewish people to then defend themselves. And in a dramatic turn of events, these scattered Jewish people reestablish themselves with newfound freedoms and protection. They resist the enemies. They win the battles, and they find their protection. But again, the point is this, that evil and destruction directed at these Jewish people, directed at God's ways, instead turns back on those who cause the harm and destroys the one who is causing the harm. That standing against God's ways ultimately leads to destruction. That is the major theme found in these two chapters. That to harbor sin in your life will lead to your destruction. Which begs the question, why? Why is it so destructive to harbor sin in your life? Well, I want to turn our thoughts to those opening statements about confession, about authenticity as a community, about the sin that operates in our lives. I want to bring this down to a more personal level. It's not so much us focusing on the evil that is out there in the world, but I want us to consider and reflect on the evil to be found within our own hearts and why it is so destructive. For we see this in the Book of Esther, right? Mordecai, he lived generously, he gave of himself, he had integrity, but Haman, he was hell-bent on his own plans, consumed by his desire for power and self-satisfaction. So why is it so destructive to stand against God? It's because of this. The longer we continue to harbor sin, the more our hearts harden. The flip side is this. The more often we make right decisions, the more our hearts soften. So that each step in life, which increases our self-confidence, our integrity, our courage, conviction, it increases our capacity to choose what is desirable. Eventually, it becomes difficult to choose what is undesirable. And the New Testament calls this training in righteousness. Our hearts begin to soften. But if we continue to harbor sin in our lives, those acts of surrender and cowardice, they weaken our resolve. And that opens more pathways to more acts of surrender. Eventually, our freedom can be lost. You will find people that have hardened their hearts. It's a very sad situation. And that's where we find ourselves in this battle between these two extremes of desiring to do what is good or sacrificing our freedoms. That's where the battle is. It's in those seemingly insignificant decisions that eventually sculpt our characters and harden them into stone or free them into flourishing. That's what we see here. I mean, take the all too common example of an affair. How many people, and you've probably met many people who've gone through some of this, but how many people do you meet that are one morning in a healthy, happy marriage, and then later that day find themselves in an affair? Nobody. An affair starts months, years earlier, thousands of earlier acts. The choice to skip, say, date nights or quit couples counseling, make flirtatious comments with coworkers, allow certain kinds of films into your life. That's where it starts. It's not one choice, one evening, but thousands of choices that all lead over a period of time to a culmination. You know, that's obviously a very difficult situation, but what about something less dramatic, say of a negative or bitter spirit? You can all struggle with this. With every decision we make to complain or criticize, play the victim, focus on the negative, we become more and more the kind of person who is by nature grouchy, unhappy, unpleasant to be around, until eventually we can lose the capacity to live gratefully and graciously in God's good world. It's that spirit of Haman, of rebellion within our own hearts. Those small decisions that you have to make today, they really matter. They matter. That's where the battle is. That is why Paul is desperate to point out to us in Romans chapter 7, as we started this message. He says, "Oh, what a miserable person I am." Verse 24. "Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death?" And he goes on, thankfully. Thank God the answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. So we're back to those opening ruminations, those considerations. How do I get clean on the inside? How do I deal with the evil within my heart? I know that harboring sin will lead to my destruction, so what can I do? Well, the answer is found in Jesus Christ. First, we admit, we confess. That's why I was trying to confess my sins. We confess our sin. We bring our rebellious hearts to God and to each other. Galatians teaches us we bear each other's burdens. We have to do it. I know we're afraid to step out into the light. I know it's difficult between your brothers and your sisters to share these things. I know how hard it is. Burden in hand, we all share the same story. We all share the same story. So do it. Come before your brothers and your sisters. Come in faith before your King, your true King, Jesus. He does not come with a golden scepter like Xerxes to rule over you with a clenched fist, with disdain and contempt. But Jesus, our true King, offers us welcome. New robes, new wine, mercy, new life in God's kingdom, so that we can come and offer up our broken ways to God. And that's not just a one-time event. when you were 12. No. You could do that today. Let go of those regs, the lesser things that hold you back. Rid yourself of cheating, of fantasy. Replace it with fullness of life in Jesus Christ. You know, the book of Esther that we've been going through here, it actually points us to Jesus. It points us back to the gospel. You see, Queen Esther, she identifies with her people. She is willing to lose the palace that her people might be saved. She is in the highest of positions, living the best, well, at least a lavish life. Yet she was willing to risk it all, her life, for her people. Jesus does more than that. He is more than willing to risk it all. More than willing to risk the palace, Jesus actually loses it all. Loss of fellowship with the Father, the Spirit, the delight of heaven, loss of all joy, loss of all power, of all goodness, to identify, to come down, to take on flesh, to be one of us. That is the King we are dealing with today. Jesus' ultimate identification, ultimate sacrifice, that we might turn from rebellion, from that spirit of Haman, from the ugly stuff, and turn in faith and hope and trust to follow after Jesus. Amen? Haman's sin, it destroyed him. So will ours. It's very destructive. So then let us cry out for mercy to our loving and gracious God, who is always and ever able and willing to receive us. Let's have the worship team come on up. And I'll just close in some prayer here. Yes, Jesus, we thank you for this book, this incredible book. And we see in it some scary things, the ugly stuff. We see our sin, and it's not pretty when you shine that spotlight. And yet it's okay because you are gracious and loving and welcoming. And you've paid the price that we might have new life. And so, Lord, help us from hiding in the shadows with whatever burdens we have. Help us to confess those burdens, to share them, to grow beyond them, to be trained in righteousness, to live as we ought. We ask this in Jesus' name.